Hey there, hi, how are you? I'm the Geek with the Gab, and as an internet movie critic, I kind of have to pay attention to the Academy Awards. My basic rundown for 2015, Birdman deserved it, Boyhood won one more than it deserved, and Fury getting shut out was a travesty. However, being the geek that it implies in my title, I started looking back at the history of the Academy Awards and found that there were not only some that I hadn't seen, but from way back there were some that I'd never even heard of. Therefore, I've decided that starting today, I'm going to bring you a review of every single winner of the Best Picture Academy Award. Starting, of course, at the very beginning. Now, before we get started, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. I am not going to be judging these movies as to whether or not they deserve to win Best Picture that year. That would involve a lot of delving into the history and watching a bulk of the movies they were up against. And from the 1927-1928 movie season, I've seen, I think, 2. Instead, what I'm going to do is take a look at the movies, strip away the gimmicks and the politics, and see how the movie stands the test of time. Without further ado, let's get started in 1927. 1927, a landmark year in film. Not only was the Academy of Motion Picture and Sciences founded, but the landscape of film was changing on a fundamental level.
Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet.
Yes, on October 6th, 1927, Al Jolson took the nation by storm with his pioneering talkie, The Jazz Singer. It was a sensation. It was a critical and financial success. So in 1929, when the Academy hosted their first ever awards ceremony, it seemed like a no-brainer, right? I mean, Al Jolson all the way, only not so much. In fact, it wasn't even considered for Best Picture, since the Academy thought it was unfair to put a talking picture up against silent ones. Oh, it walked away with an honorary award for revolutionizing the industry, but the first ever Best Picture was Wings, a silent film about World War I fighter pilots. Yeah, don't worry, I hadn't heard of it either. But at the time, it was a huge financial success. See, 1927 also saw the first transatlantic flight by Charles Lindbergh, Lucky Lindy himself, which piqued the nation's interest in the field of aviation. So when 3 months later Wings hit theaters featuring revolutionary filming techniques of real planes and real action, plus now forgotten it girl Clara Bow, it did very well for itself. But does it stand the test of time? Let's find out. The technical. See this? Not so impressive, huh? Until you realize that this actor's actually flying, with a camera strapped to the front of a real functioning plane. For reference, this is what the average camera looked like at the time. Yeah, that was strapped to the front of these planes. On top of that, no miniatures were used for the dangerous stunts. This, real plane, real building. This, real plane, real smoke. Remember, at this point in film history, special effects were just fancy jump cuts. The idea of putting fake smoke in during post-production wasn't even thought of. The cinematography is well done for the time. Even today, a shot like this is not easy. But again, imagine doing it with this. Yeah, there are jump cuts and continuity errors galore, but that was all part of the scene back then. Still, the movie doesn't have that overly jumpy, rushed pace that tends to leap to mind with silent movies. And the pacing is surprisingly decent, considering the total standstill roadblocks that are title cards. That's not easy, especially when the movie clocks in at nearly 2.5 hours. Which brings us to the writing. Obviously, being a silent movie, the dialogue is pretty sparse, something that takes some getting used to. On top of that, some of the dialogue that is there hasn't aged well. I'm not too proud to admit I laughed way too much at the two main characters, played by Charles Buddy Rogers and Richard Arlen, discussing how much they hope they spot a couple of heinies on their flight. The film can hardly be blamed for that though, as it's a nearly 90-year-old movie taking place about 100 years ago. There's going to be some outdated language. However, in terms of story, Wings holds up surprisingly well, delivering an evolving story with surprising maturity. At the start of the movie, the main characters, Jack Powell and David Armstrong, are full of wide-eyed wonder at the prospect of being fighter pilots, off to fight for their country. However, as the film continues pitting them against the horrible truths of war, the movie becomes more bleak, filled with a longing for home and a fierce determination to cling to what kept them human in the first place, with Armstrong holding tight to a small childhood teddy bear as a good luck charm. There's some pretty cheesy slapstick humor shoehorned in with the character of Hermann Schwimpf, who is constantly picked on because of his German-sounding name, despite being a true blue patriot. Just check his tattoo. And the inclusion of Clara Bow as Mary Preston is clearly a marketing move, with Bow being among the biggest names in the business at the time. Despite top billing, she's in maybe half the movie, and doesn't really play a pivotal role while she's there. All the same, her character does bring some of that lost humanity back, especially in a sequence where Powell is on leave in Paris. It doesn't help her feel any more relevant with the most gratuitous topless scene I have ever witnessed, and one of the earliest, which just reeks of a marketing ploy. But at the absolute worst, the character is reasonably inoffensive, and at best, she's a welcome supporting character. The acting. Let's go back to this shot. This actor is actually flying this plane. Not only is he flying, he's also having to frame the shot, keeping clouds and other planes in the background, with a big heavy camera strapped to the front of the plane, all while acting. Not that the scenes of them flying requires any great feat of acting, but to have to keep that all in mind and turn in a believable performance, which they do with few exceptions, is extremely impressive. On top of that, Richard Arlen, this guy here, along with several extras, had never flown a plane before being cast. While on the ground, our two leads turn in capable performances, though neither of them took home an award for the film. Of some interest is a brief performance by the late great Gary Cooper as Corporal Buzzkill here. Yeah, that's like the 7th sentence he ever says to them. And then he dies. Just that suddenly. Clara Bow gives a magnetic performance with the wide-eyed yet mischievous persona that made her famous, but with little screen time and even less to do, she's far from a selling point. She wasn't all that fond of being in Wings either, saying at one point, "Wings is a man's picture, and I'm just the whipped cream on top of the pie." Also of some interest, this movie features one of the first instances of male nudity, and one of the first man-on-man kisses. Neither of these add much to the movie, but it's an interesting footnote. Wings is a largely forgotten movie. Between the age of it and the overshadowing presence of the revolutionary jazz singer, it kinda gets lost in the shuffle of film history. But that doesn't make it a bad movie, not by a long shot. See, I have a hard time with silent movies, for a variety of personal reasons. It's not that I don't appreciate them, it's they just don't grab my attention all that well. This movie, clocking in at about 2 hours and 20 minutes, complete with an opening overture and an intermission, held my attention for the entire run. I felt for the characters, even the largely unnecessary Mary Preston. It gives a shockingly mature view on the horrors of war, something that would be revisited a couple years later in All Quiet on the Western Front, another Best Picture winner. The Jazz Singer may be the standout hit of 1927 now, but looking back, especially when put side by side with Wings, Jolson's film is little more than a generic silent film with a few jaunty tunes thrown in, and with some far more offensive material than calling a few Germans heinies. The movie business owes a debt of gratitude to the Jazz Singer, that much is for sure, but on balance, Wings rises head and shoulders over the competition on this one. One down. Oh. 80 some odd to go.